Hey there. Nothing too existential happening today. Something popped into my little gourd. Thinking about a new project I'm doing and scripting a comic story for it. And I already have a plot in mind. So while thinking of the plot, it's like, well, visualizing things from the beginning. It's like, well, I'll have a sort of a long shot, establish locale, characters seen from a distance, small, something like that. And then it's like, well, that's sort of cinematic storyboard approach sort of thing. And like, well, how far do you want to go into that? How far do I want to go in that direction? And that led to another subject, which is something I've been aware of for quite some time now, because in comics, for a long time, Silver Age. Hi. Silver Age. Basically, the artists, especially the Marvel method, the artists told the story. Stan Lee would come in and add captions and dialogue and things like that. But basically, comics is essentially a visual medium drawn by the artist. You could say the artist was in ascendance, but basically the artist was just doing their job. And there's something important to remember about comics, and that is if you take away the pictures, you don't have comics. You might have a novel or something. But if you take away the words, you still have comics. So the very nature of comics is that they are image driven, and that the images come first. Basically, comics at their strongest, in my humble opinion, is when you can, you might not necessarily have to read every single word. You can get the idea of what's going on from the pictures, right? So anyway, in the past, as I mentioned, if the artist could have been seen as in ascension, it's the tables have turned, and now it's the writers. And it's funny to me to even say that, the writers, because what happens when a writer sits down to write a comic story, they become obsessed with focused on the words, the dialogue, things like that. So you're going to get literary types of effects, clever wordplay, things like that. You want to have, complex plot twists, plot points, things that are often thought of in film. And so essentially what happens to the artists, because the artist is not in ascendance anymore, is that the artist becomes simply a pair of hands to serve the writer. So, the guy who's the top writer, I suppose, in comics would be Neil Gaiman, who's a nice guy, talented, clever. He does do thumbnails for the artist. But anyway, unfortunately what's happened is that I think artists dropped the ball, basically failed the medium for the most part. They failed to meet the challenge. And why is this? Well, historically, in comics, there are a lot of people that came into comics from other fields. They came out of World War II. Jack Kirby, for example, he had worked in animation, things like that, and they basically came from the real world. And the Marvel age, it began to fold when Stan Lee couldn't handle the workload anymore. So looking for other people to come in and take over. And basically what happened was that the fan base, if they had a problem thinking of what Iron Man should do next issue, hell, all you gotta do is, read the letters. The fans will tell you what they want. And fans, unfortunately, were basically children. And they would get caught up in this childlike stuff like, who's stronger, the Hulk or the Thing? Let's have them, fight, regardless of how they got there or anything like that. And essentially, the industry got taken over by children. And maybe they got what they wanted, but the form itself suffered immeasurably. And there was something else, phenomenon, that I've never heard anyone talk about, but which has occurred to me, which if you look at the history before the Marvel age, basically the Fantastic Four started it. Kirby, who was basically the driving force behind all the stories and things for Marvel, with some help from Stan Lee, of course. But he had already been working in comics for decades, and he had, with Joe Simon, basically pioneered the love comic, romance comics. Before them, they invented it. There had been no romance comics before them. So, what happens when you draw romance comics for 10 or 12 years? And there's, hardly any fight scenes or anything. There's, you're drawing people, in these emotional states, basically love. And you got to be good at it. And if you've ever read any of these stories, which I have, the quality is incredible. Because of course back then, romance comics were, they were mainstream, mass media. Incredible numbers of people read them. They had to be good. The stories, in many cases, I think were as good as Hollywood films that were being made at the time. So anyway, Kirby did that. Then after that, there were sort of some doldrums and doing these giant monster comics, monsters invade the earth. And, and then when Fantastic Four came along, what is the comic really about? What is the theme? What holds it together with the characters? Well, what I would argue is that it's not about action. It's not about, the Thing being strong or anything like that. It's basically about love. Because Kirby had gotten so good at drawing people in love, you could tell from just looking at the panel something about how he did that. So anyway, with the Fantastic Four, it was very clear to the reader, perhaps maybe not consciously, but nonetheless it was there, that this was a family and that they loved each other. And so when there was a threat, it magnified all that. right? So anyway, that's what made it take off. I think people sensed that was the underlying theme, love. So then look what happened. Marvel tried to copy itself. Oh, we need another title like this, A Team. And it's like, well, it's not about a team. It's about a family. So the next idea was the X-Men, to cash in on the Fantastic Four thing. Well, they called it a school, because you had one teacher who was basically in a wheelchair. But the book was a dud. It stunk for years and years and years and years and years, and I still think it sort of stinks. Because what it's about is not love, because it's not a family. So what is it? It's basically delinquency. A group of juvenile delinquents, a gang in a sense. So sure, you can make movies and stories, comics about gangs. Just don't expect any of it to have much, to care, much empathy or to care about what's happening to these characters. What difference does it make? All that's important is their powers, how they look, and, the fighting and the bad guy and stuff like that. So that's what we've come to. So the artist is not in control anymore, and to tell the truth, there aren't too many artists that do everything, that tell the story and draw it and everything. My own work is a little peculiar because what I've done, I was trying to explain this to someone the other day, is that if you have a spectrum, right, spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum is utter trash, drive-in movies or the worst comic or something like that. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have, the greatest works of art, fiction, film, music, things like that, right? That's the spectrum. So normally you can put something somewhere on that spectrum. You can take Star Wars or some crap like that and say, okay, well, it's much closer to the camp and the pulp pole than to the, masterpiece pole, the real art, the fine art pole. So basically, the spectrum has trash at one end and brilliance at the other end, art at the other end, right? And there have been plenty of books, movies, and things like that that were trashy, sort of, appeared to be, made on a budget, but nonetheless were profound in some way. So what I try to do in comics is to be at both poles and not in the middle. So it's pretending to be trash, yet is profound. Whether it is or not, well, who cares, who knows, because no one pays attention to artists and people like me, independent, completely independent creators. As a matter of fact, the way I work, I heard Neil Gaiman giving a talk the other day, and he talked about how he works, that basically if he has an idea that he wants to pursue over here, he goes over there and does it, regardless of whether it would succeed or not. And that's the success of it is not part of his plan. And I've done so many projects where success is not part of the plan. And I do sell them. I do make money from them. I'm not a household household name like Neil Gaiman. If I were, then I could wipe my butt on some toilet paper and people would buy that. But anyway, so the fact that the fulcrum has sort of shifted, and that the writer is in ascendance now, and that love is gone from comics, and it's basically scenarios of delinquency run by children. You know, it's not too good. And you know, I've seen some superhero films, for example, some of the recent ones, and for the most part, you know, they're action oriented, because the way CGI is nowadays, they can do anything, and so there's a lot of movement. You know, even the last Star Trek movie I saw, it's like you got some characters in it, you know, but you got these tremendous action, and action is epic, you know, crashes and all this other stuff. And it's not to say there's not a place for that, but when that's all you get, then you kind of become more aware, I hope, of the vacuum. So anyway, just this topic to run my mouth about while I'm taking my walk today. I came out and ran yesterday. I did this whole thing in no time, but not running today. But anyway, thanks for listening, and let me know what you think, and where you think comics are today, and what's next.